The first thing people noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a thick, listening quiet that pressed against the ears as soon as the forest road disappeared behind the trees. Birds avoided the area. Insects fell still. Even the wind seemed to lose its courage there, as if something deeper in the woods had taught it to stay away. Locals whispered that the silence belonged to a pair of twins who lived beyond the last broken fence, in a house that did not appear on maps and did not welcome visitors twice. They had been born together, raised together, and never truly separated, not by distance, not by law, not by morality. As children they mirrored one another with unsettling precision, finishing each other's sentences, sharing thoughts without speaking, watching the world with the same cold, measuring eyes. When they grew older, they turned inward instead of outward, rejecting neighbors, rejecting change, rejecting the idea that blood should ever thin. The marriage happened quietly, without witnesses, sealed not by vows but by a shared belief that purity was something that could be protected, perfected, even engineered. The children came later. One by one. No birth records. No school enrollments. No doctor visits. Just faint lights glowing in the windows at night and strange sounds drifting through the trees, rhythmic tapping, muffled cries, the scrape of metal against stone. Hunters spoke of finding notebooks scattered near abandoned trails, filled with symbols, measurements, and sketches of human anatomy drawn with disturbing tenderness. They said the twins were studying something, testing something, convinced that their blood carried a secret the outside world was too weak to understand. People who tried to investigate rarely stayed long. Some claimed the twins watched them from behind the trees, smiling in perfect unison. Others swore they heard children laughing deep in the woods, though no children were ever seen. And then there were those who never came back at all, leaving behind vehicles rusting at the edge of the forest and questions that no one dared to ask too loudly. What the twins were searching for, whether immortality, perfection, or something far darker, was buried beneath years of isolation and fear. But the truth, like the forest itself, had a way of swallowing those who stepped too close. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the roots and rotting floorboards, the experiments continued, waiting to be discovered by someone who would not turn back. The story begins with the forest itself becoming a warning, long before anyone speaks the twins' names aloud. Hunters who had walked those trails for decades start noticing how sound dies as they move deeper between the trees, as if the woods are swallowing noise on purpose. Footsteps feel heavier, breathing feels too loud, and instinct urges them to turn back even when there is no obvious threat. At first, people laugh it off as superstition, blaming weather or imagination, but the silence repeats itself every time someone crosses the same invisible boundary. Dogs refuse to follow. Horses panic and rear. Compasses spin uselessly, never pointing the same direction twice. The first disappearance seems ordinary on paper. A seasonal surveyor is sent to confirm property lines near the forest's edge, a task that should take a single afternoon. His truck is later found parked neatly beside the road, keys still in the ignition, lunch untouched on the passenger seat. There are no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no footprints leading away, only the sensation that something is missing from the air itself. Search parties form, but the deeper they go, the quieter everything becomes. Radios crackle and die. Shouted names fall flat, as if absorbed before they can echo. Whispers spread quickly in a small community. Some recall old warnings passed down by grandparents about the mirrored ones who lived where paths stopped making sense. Others remember seeing two identical figures years ago, standing side by side near the tree line, watching without waving or speaking. Official reports avoid speculation, yet unease grows when another person vanishes months later under nearly identical circumstances. The forest does not give bodies back. It does not leave evidence. It simply closes. As fear takes root, the silence becomes personal. People begin to hear things at night from their homes miles away, soft, synchronized footsteps in dreams, a child's laughter carried on wind that never reaches their windows. Those who drive past the forest feel watched, counting two shadows where there should only be trees. The idea forms slowly but firmly that whatever lives out there does not hunt randomly. It observes, measures, waits. By the time authorities consider sealing the area off, the woods have already claimed a reputation that no fence can contain. The silence is no longer just an absence of sound but a presence, something deliberate and patient, stretching deeper into the community, pulling attention toward the twins' hidden home where lights flicker at night and shapes move behind curtains in perfect, mirrored motion. Long before the forest became a place of disappearances, the twins themselves were already unsettling those who knew them as children. They were born minutes apart in a remote farmhouse during a winter storm so severe that the midwife later swore the wind had screamed like a living thing as the second child entered the world. From the beginning, the twins behaved less like two individuals and more like a single consciousness divided between two bodies. They cried together, fell silent together, and stared for long stretches at the same corners of the room as if following something unseen. Their parents tried to raise them normally, but neighbors noticed how the twins refused to play with other children. When approached, they would stop moving entirely and turn in perfect synchronization, their expressions empty yet alert. Teachers described an eerie intelligence that did not express curiosity or joy, only observation. If one twin was asked a question, the other would answer, often with unsettling accuracy, as though the thought had never belonged to just one of them. Punishments and rewards failed to separate their behavior, reinforcing the sense that discipline reached only the surface of something deeper and unreachable. As they grew older, their bond tightened rather than loosened. Puberty did not bring rebellion or social interest, only further withdrawal. They began wearing the same clothes, cutting their hair the same way, mirroring gestures unconsciously. Rumors spread after classmates claimed to have overheard the twins speaking to each other in whispers that sounded less like conversation and more like rehearsals. They were said to repeat phrases about blood, symmetry, and correction, words far beyond what their age should have allowed them to understand. The first true break from the outside world came when their parents died within months of each other, both from sudden illnesses that doctors could not fully explain. The twins refused autopsies and closed the farmhouse gates permanently. No one attended the small burial held at dawn, but people passing by later reported seeing two identical figures standing at the graves, hands clasped, faces calm rather than grieving. From that point on, the twins' presence in the community faded into something closer to rumor. They stopped attending town events, stopped responding to mail, stopped acknowledging the passage of time. Supplies were obtained in bulk and carried back into the woods without conversation. Those who crossed paths with them described an overwhelming sensation of being examined, as if the twins were not seeing a person but a set of variables. Whatever bond had formed in the womb had matured into a shared purpose, one that no longer required witnesses or approval, only isolation and patience. The decision to marry was never announced and never celebrated, yet it altered the atmosphere of the forest as sharply as a storm breaking overhead. Neighbors pieced it together slowly through absences and uneasy observations, realizing that the twins no longer referred to themselves separately even in practical matters. Property taxes were paid under a single signature. Supplies were ordered for the household, never specifying names. When questioned by a county clerk about marital status for a form, both twins answered at once, voices overlapping, confirming what no one had been prepared to hear. In their minds, the choice did not feel transgressive or defiant. It felt inevitable. From childhood, they had rejected the notion that identity required separation, believing instead that division weakened what nature had deliberately mirrored. Marriage, to them, was not a social bond but a structural one, a way to seal what had always existed. They studied historical cases in isolation, poring over old texts and medical journals salvaged from libraries hours away, fascinated by how outsiders framed fear as morality. Where others saw taboo, they saw interruption, a forced break in a design that was never meant to be diluted. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place inside the farmhouse long after sunset. No officiant. No witnesses. Only candles arranged in exact symmetry and handwritten vows spoken simultaneously, word for word, without rehearsal. They bound their hands together with a strip of cloth cut from the same garment, believing shared fabric carried shared intent. Outside, the forest was unnaturally still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. When rumors finally surfaced, the town reacted with discomfort rather than outrage. People avoided direct confrontation, choosing distance instead. Some argued it was a private matter, while others feared provoking something they did not understand. The twins sensed this shift and welcomed it. Isolation was no longer an inconvenience but a condition they could shape. They reinforced fences, blocked old paths, and marked boundaries with symbols no one recognized, ensuring that curiosity would fade into caution. The marriage deepened their withdrawal and sharpened their focus. Conversations between them grew more technical, filled with discussions about inheritance, correction, and improvement. They spoke of lineage not as ancestry but as material, something that could be refined through control and repetition. Love, as outsiders defined it, had little relevance. What bound them was conviction, a belief that they alone understood what their blood represented and what it could become if left uncorrupted. By the time the forest swallowed its first secret completely, the twins were no longer pretending to live alongside the world beyond the trees. They had stepped fully into a closed system of their own making where nothing entered without permission and nothing left without purpose. The arrival of the first child did not soften the twins or draw them back toward the outside world. Instead, it seemed to validate everything they had believed in silence. The pregnancy was hidden carefully, explained away to the rare supplier who noticed changes as illness or weight. No doctor was consulted, no midwife invited. When the child was born, it happened on the farmhouse floor, under dim light, with both twins moving in perfect coordination, as if following instructions memorized long ago. There was no panic, no hesitation, only focus. The cry of the newborn was brief before being quieted, not out of cruelty but control. From the beginning, the child was treated less as a person and more as proof. Every movement was recorded, every sound noted. The twins measured growth with obsessive precision, marking walls with dates and symbols instead of names. They spoke about the child in terms of outcomes and patterns, watching for signs that their shared blood had produced something purer, something improved. Affection existed, but it was clinical, expressed through observation rather than comfort. When the child cried, they listened closely, not for distress, but for irregularities. As months passed, strange routines took shape within the farmhouse. Rooms were repurposed into controlled environments where light, temperature, and sound were carefully manipulated. The twins exposed the child to long periods of silence, then sudden noise, tracking reactions with meticulous interest. They altered diets, adjusted sleep cycles, introduced stimuli designed to provoke fear or calm, documenting every response in notebooks that filled shelves. To them, this was not abuse but refinement, an experiment meant to uncover what their bloodline was capable of when shaped without interference. The forest became an extension of these trials. The child was taken outside at odd hours, placed among the trees while the twins observed from a distance, testing instinct, orientation, and resilience. Sometimes the child was left alone just long enough to panic before being retrieved. Other times, they waited to see whether silence would teach adaptation. The woods absorbed the child's cries easily, adding another layer to the growing stillness that outsiders would later sense without understanding. When a second child arrived, the twins compared relentlessly. Differences were flagged as flaws, similarities praised as success. The children were pitted against each other subtly, exposed to uneven conditions to see which traits endured. Pain was not avoided, it was measured. Fear was not soothed, it was studied. What disturbed them most was not suffering but unpredictability. By the time distant neighbors noticed lights flickering through the farmhouse windows at impossible hours and heard faint sounds that did not belong to animals, the twins were already convinced they were close to something important, something that justified every choice they had made and every line they had crossed. As the years passed, the experiments intensified and the boundaries between observation and cruelty dissolved completely. The twins began to suspect that whatever they were searching for could not be revealed through controlled conditions alone. They believed stress, fear, and deprivation were necessary catalysts, forces that would strip away weakness and expose the true potential hidden in shared blood. The children were no longer monitored only within the farmhouse or the forest edge. They were pushed deeper into isolation, kept from any language or behavior that might resemble normal childhood. Words were limited. Touch was regulated. Even eye contact was sometimes withheld for days, all to see what would break and what would adapt. At night, the farmhouse came alive with activity. Lantern light moved from room to room as the twins adjusted restraints, changed environments, and recorded reactions in precise, mirrored handwriting. They tested pain thresholds not with sudden violence but with gradual escalation, watching closely for patterns in breathing, muscle tension, and vocalization. If one child screamed too quickly, that response was logged as failure. If another remained silent too long, it was flagged as concerning in a different way. Success, to the twins, existed somewhere between endurance and obedience. The forest trials grew darker. Children were led blindfolded into unfamiliar sections of the woods and left there as daylight faded, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. The twins observed silently from hidden positions, listening to footsteps stumble, to whispered pleas dissolve into panic. They noted how long it took before fear turned into stillness, whether that stillness was resignation or calculation. Retrieval did not always come when expected. Occasionally, it did not come at all, and the absence of a child was treated not as loss but as data. Strange sounds began to carry beyond the trees. Locals reported hearing rhythmic knocking at night, uneven footsteps pacing the woods, and soft cries that cut off abruptly. A hiker once found a child's shoe near a creek, far from any known trail, but when authorities searched the area, nothing else was recovered. The twins dismissed outside concern as ignorance, reinforcing their belief that the world beyond the forest was incapable of understanding necessity. Inside the farmhouse, notebooks multiplied. Pages filled with diagrams of nervous systems, blood samples dried onto paper, symbols connecting generations that existed only in theory. The twins spoke less often now, relying on glances and gestures, unified by a growing certainty that they were close to achieving proof. Whatever remained of the children's individuality was fading under pressure, reshaped into something quieter, harder, and more alarming than either success or failure. By the time the twins reached middle age, the forest had become an extension of their home and their experiments, a living apparatus in which every tree, root, and shadow served a purpose. They no longer ventured into town except under disguise, and even then, only for supplies that could not be obtained through other means. The children, now older and conditioned by years of manipulation, rarely saw outsiders and had little concept of a world beyond the woods. Their existence was measured in routines dictated by the twins, testing, observing, correcting, and repeating. Any deviation from prescribed behavior was met with immediate attention, sometimes through punishment, sometimes through extended observation designed to expose hidden weakness. The twins spoke of the children less as offspring and more as variables in a controlled experiment that had grown beyond theory into full, living reality. Locals who wandered near the forest edges began reporting sightings of the twins, always together, always moving in precise, mirrored motion. Some claimed the twins' gaze followed them even when half hidden behind trees, their eyes reflecting an unnerving intelligence that seemed to assess and categorize. Farmers noticed livestock disappearing in odd patterns, and children dared not cross the woods on errands or shortcuts, for fear that the twins were watching from the shadows. Yet no one could place blame directly, and the forest seemed to protect the twins, absorbing noise and obscuring paths so that even those who meant harm often found themselves lost, frustrated, or frightened into retreat. Inside the house, the twins' obsession with perfection escalated. They began combining lessons learned from years of observation with more deliberate experiments. The children were exposed to increasingly complex stimuli, fear paired with reward, isolation followed by forced social interaction with one another, variations in light and sound intended to provoke instinctive responses. The twins meticulously recorded reactions, adding layers of detail to notebooks that had multiplied into stacks taller than the children themselves. Each page was an attempt to map behavior, predict outcomes, and refine a method that could not fail. They believed they were approaching a threshold, a moment when the experiment would reveal the latent superiority of their bloodline. Nothing beyond the forest mattered, for they had concluded that humanity outside their control was irrelevant, weak, and incapable of understanding the purpose of their work. As the children grew older, subtle changes began to appear. Their faces, once soft with childhood, now carried an unsettling precision, expressions so controlled and synchronized that observers might swear they were witnessing not human beings, but extensions of the twins themselves. Speech patterns, gestures, even moments of hesitation were carefully monitored and corrected. The twins whispered of legacy and lineage as if they were discussing engineering plans rather than lives. Outside the forest, rumors multiplied. A neighbor would vanish temporarily, returning with pale skin and distant eyes. An abandoned cabin would be found with strange symbols etched into its walls. The forest, and the twins within it, seemed to be reaching outward, extending influence beyond its physical boundaries while remaining entirely untouchable. As the twins' children entered adolescence, the experiments reached a new level of calculated complexity, pushing moral boundaries into territories the outside world could scarcely imagine. The twins began orchestrating scenarios in which fear, curiosity, and survival instincts collided, believing that only through extreme conditions could the children's inherent traits, those that had been carefully nurtured from birth, truly reveal themselves. Rooms were altered with precision, some were kept in near-total darkness for hours, others flooded with harsh light, each environment designed to provoke distinct reactions. Every heartbeat, every tremor of the hand, every sharp intake of breath was meticulously recorded, annotated with symbols and graphs that filled pages and pages of notebooks now stacked like towers in the farmhouse corners. The twins rarely slept, their movements synchronized even as fatigue set in, their eyes scanning, calculating, and correcting what they observed. The forest outside became a laboratory of its own. The twins led the children through unfamiliar trails under varying conditions, sometimes during storms, sometimes in the dead stillness of early morning. The children were instructed to navigate mazes of branches and roots while blindfolded or with their sight restricted. At times, the twins allowed small animals to pass near them, watching how instinct guided reaction. They tested patience, observation, and reaction to threat, noting subtle shifts in gaze, posture, and respiration. Every experiment was treated not as a moment of cruelty but as a demonstration of what they believed nature had intended, a refinement of the bloodline, a process that demanded attention, endurance, and conformity. Tensions occasionally surfaced. The children, now aware in fragments of their confinement, would attempt small acts of defiance. One might hide a notebook, another might step slightly off the trail, yet these moments were always caught, recorded, and treated as data points rather than rebellion. The twins never reacted with overt anger, their corrections were cold and systematic. They would return the child to the path, adjust the environment slightly, and observe again, patient as though each test were a mechanical procedure rather than a human interaction. Meanwhile, whispers in the surrounding area grew louder. Travelers reported hearing soft cries or laughter when the wind blew through the forest in a certain way. Hunters saw flickering lanterns in abandoned fields, moving with unnerving precision. Occasionally, a visitor would glimpse one of the twins at the tree line, their mirrored stance perfectly rigid, eyes following silently as if reading thoughts. No one dared approach the house, and the forest itself seemed to conspire with them, obscuring trails and muffling sound, keeping their experiments hidden from all who might judge or interfere. The twins' obsession had transformed from secrecy into an almost sacred ritual. Each day, each trial, each record added weight to the belief that their methods were justified, that the children were becoming something extraordinary under their guidance, and that the world outside would never understand the purpose of what they had begun decades ago. By the time the twins' children reached late adolescence, the experiments had evolved into a cruel choreography of control and observation, one that blurred the lines between nurture and manipulation beyond recognition. Every aspect of daily life was regimented and recorded with obsessive precision. Meals were calculated to elicit physical or emotional reactions, sleep was controlled to test endurance and cognitive response, interactions between the children were deliberately structured to provoke rivalry, cooperation, or confusion, depending on what the twins wanted to observe. The farmhouse itself had become a labyrinth of chambers and partitions, some padded, some bare, each designed to heighten sensory perception or dampen it entirely. Even the furniture was arranged according to patterns the twins believed would influence behavior and thought, as though every angle and surface were instruments in a larger experiment. Outside, the forest served as both a tool and a shield. Paths were intentionally confusing, marked with subtle symbols only the twins understood. The children were sent on tasks that forced them to navigate alone, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes carrying objects too fragile or heavy for their age, all while the twins observed from hidden vantage points. When mistakes occurred, Corrections were implemented not through punishment alone but through repetition, environmental adjustment, or withdrawal of comfort, forcing the children to internalize lessons as instinct rather than conscious understanding. The twins recorded every response with the precision of scientists documenting a rare species, noting heart rate, posture, eye movement, and vocal intonation. Strain began to show in the children's expressions and movements, subtle cracks in behavior that fascinated the twins rather than alarmed them. Siblings would exchange glances, sometimes synchronizing in ways that mirrored the twins themselves, suggesting that the conditioning was taking root. Yet there were anomalies, moments of hesitation or refusal, that prompted immediate analysis. The twins would discuss these anomalies in whispers, rarely aloud, debating methods of correction, adjusting routines, and devising scenarios to test persistence, obedience, or intelligence. Each adjustment became a calculated step toward a goal that only the twins fully understood, an endgame built over decades of isolation, study, and unwavering discipline. The broader world remained unaware, but rumors were beginning to coalesce into fear. Locals reported seeing lights in the farmhouse at impossible hours, sometimes flickering as if someone or multiple someones moved in perfect, mirrored patterns. Travelers spoke of hearing faint cries or laughter that seemed to vanish as quickly as it arrived. Occasionally, hunters glimpsed figures on the tree line, standing unnervingly still, reflecting the exact posture of one another, as if the forest itself had taken human form. The twins' domain had expanded beyond the physical boundaries of the house and property, influencing perception and imagination alike, making the woods an extension of their control and the children living instruments in a meticulous, hidden symphony of experimentation. By the time the twins' children were fully grown, the experiments had transformed into something almost ritualistic, a disciplined and deliberate shaping of life that existed outside any notion of morality recognized by the outside world. Every moment of their existence had been calculated, every response catalogued, every deviation noted as a data point in notebooks that now filled entire rooms. The children were not merely subjects, they had become extensions of the twins' purpose, embodying decades of observation, deprivation, and conditioning. Their movements, expressions, and reactions had been refined to near perfection, and yet the twins were never satisfied. There was always another test, another variable to manipulate, another measure of endurance or obedience to extract. The children had been forced to navigate increasingly extreme environments. The forest became an arena of isolation and challenge, with paths deliberately confusing and hazards introduced to test problem-solving, resilience, and instinct. At times, they were sent out alone with only minimal guidance, learning to navigate the twisted trails, dense undergrowth, and the occasional wild creature. Each misstep was recorded, analyzed, and corrected, each success noted as evidence of improvement. The twins themselves remained invisible observers, their presence felt only in the consequences of their careful manipulation, and in the synchronized way they moved when they finally emerged to collect the results. Inside the farmhouse, daily life had become an unbroken chain of experiments. Light, sound, temperature, and diet were all adjusted to provoke specific responses. The children were constantly monitored, not just for immediate reactions but for the long-term effects of cumulative stress, control, and conditioning. Social interaction was limited to controlled exchanges, designed to encourage loyalty, cooperation, or competition as the twins deemed necessary. Even emotional responses were treated as measurable phenomena: fear, attachment, defiance, and curiosity, all catalogued, compared, and refined. Despite the isolation, the forest beyond the farmhouse continued to whisper of the twins' presence. Travelers reported fleeting glimpses of identical figures moving together with unnerving precision, lanterns flickering behind windows at hours when no one should have been awake, and sounds that seemed both human and mechanical in their rhythm. Occasional footprints, items left carelessly along abandoned trails, or glimpses of children in strange postures only added to the sense that something unnatural was being perfected within the woods. Locals spoke in hushed tones, wary of crossing into territory they did not understand, and authorities who investigated found nothing tangible, only impressions, suggestions, and the weight of silence. The twins' obsession had reached a point where the distinction between experiment and life had vanished. The children were no longer merely growing, they were being shaped, refined, and honed into living embodiments of a vision that the twins alone fully comprehended, a legacy constructed in shadows and silence, hidden from the world but impossible to entirely escape once you had glimpsed its presence. As the twins aged, the culmination of decades of isolation and experimentation became increasingly evident. The children, now young adults, were precise reflections of their upbringing, their gestures, speech, and even posture echoing the meticulous conditioning imposed upon them since birth. The twins observed them with a satisfaction that was clinical rather than emotional, as though every trial, every deprivation, and every manipulation had been a step toward proving a singular point: that blood, when controlled and refined, could yield something beyond ordinary human limits. Yet even at this stage, perfection remained elusive, and the twins' obsession intensified, driving them to devise ever more extreme methods of testing endurance, obedience, and instinct. The forest itself seemed to have absorbed their influence. Hunters and wanderers reported the same eerie experiences they had decades earlier: footsteps that matched one another too precisely to be coincidental, shadows that moved in perfect synchrony, and lanterns appearing where no house should exist. Some claimed to hear laughter, cries, or whispers that seemed to emanate from deep within the trees, fading the moment one tried to locate the source. The woods had become an extension of the twins' control, a living experiment in observation and manipulation, where every rustle, every break of a branch, and every shift in light was both deliberate and consequential. The children themselves had internalized the rules of this hidden world. They responded to cues with unthinking precision, anticipating their parents' instructions even before they were spoken. Small mistakes were noted, corrected, and incorporated into a growing archive of data that chronicled human response in unprecedented detail. The twins spoke in hushed tones about patterns and outcomes, referring to their offspring as vessels of refinement, embodiments of a lineage honed by calculated stress and controlled environments. Emotions, spontaneity, and individuality had been subordinated to the larger experiment, leaving behind beings shaped more by instruction than by instinct, yet terrifyingly alive in their obedience. Rumors in surrounding communities had long hardened into legend. Travelers disappeared temporarily, only to return disoriented, their stories dismissed as exaggeration or misperception. Hunters avoided certain paths entirely, noting the unnatural symmetry of tracks and disturbances in areas that should have been undisturbed. Occasionally, someone glimpsed the twins or their children from a distance, their mirrored movements and uncanny stillness leaving witnesses unnerved. No authority could penetrate the forest's secrecy, no outsider could fully comprehend the calculated horror unfolding within the farmhouse. Even as the twins' bodies aged, their minds remained acute, continuously adapting their methods, refining routines, and orchestrating conditions to push the children further. Every day became a test of endurance and observation, every response a new piece of evidence. They had achieved a form of mastery over their bloodline, but mastery itself was never enough. The forest, the farmhouse, and the children were all instruments in a pursuit of understanding and control that was limitless, unrelenting, and entirely hidden from the outside world.